get ready, but that's it. Yeah, so we're this is my favorite time. My little grandson asked me, why do we decorate Christmas? I said, well, it's Jesus' birthday. We decorate for your birthday, so we're decorating for his birthday. And we agreed. Well, how do we do presents? I said, because we can't give them directly to Jesus, so we give them to each other. Trying to on that floor, 5th grade level. I mean, I'm 5-year
title was. Local minister prophesies about Patrick Mahomes or something. And I don't remember, I want to say, I was living in Oklahoma City at the time, so I'm assuming it was one of the local Oklahoma City news outlets, because they all ran a story. One of them came out to my office and did an interview, set up a whole deal in my office. But I want to say it was one of them that is funny.
Yeah, well, like when you started, like, so they asked the class, what they project, I remember what, no.
What?
Yeah, like a picture. Yeah.
What are the odds?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Everybody good? Charles is good?
Yeah.
That was it's amazing how that still comes up. I got a couple weeks ago. I got
Reagan
an
and
email
Chance are already
from
in Vegas.
a producer
And
for
Connor
the
and
NFL.
Smith and the kids.
They're
And
making
we're leaving Tuesday.
they're making a documentary
Taylor,
on the history of the
and
Kansas
kids,
City
me,
Chiefs,
and
and they
my
wanted to
mom.
feature that in
Go out there and watch
the
it.
documentary. So
Get back to
they reached out
it's
for
a-
permission,
it is
so we'll
good
see
just
if
to
they actually
a break.
Sometimes just a different
use it.
scenery.
Yes.
For routines.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah, no,
that was
and
one
they
thing
have
that was interesting to me
called
was
Cowboy
so
Christmas. It's in
All right, we'll get started. We are on Psalm 78, which is a long one. So we read the first 8 verses last week. To get started, we will read verses 9 through 20 this morning. The Ephraimites, armed with the bow, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to his law. They forgot what he had done and the miracles that he had shown them. In the sight of their ancestors, he worked marvels in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan. He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime he led them with a cloud, and all night long with a fiery light. He split rocks open in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. Yet they sinned still more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness? Even though he struck the rock so that water gushed out and torrents overflowed, can he also give bread or provide meat for his people?" Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we study your words. It is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right. So last week we finished the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so we're going to enter into something new this morning. We're going to move to the New Testament, and we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark. It will be a couple of weeks, maybe even next year, before we actually get into the text of Mark. We're going to do a lot of introductory work that once we get into the text of Mark, you'll see, I think, the benefits of us painting a little bit of a broad landscape of what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. I have to say I am very, very, very excited to start this series because this is my wheelhouse. I know most of y'all know that my area of scholarly study, my PhD dissertation, is all in gospel research. And so this is something that I'm excited to finally be able to teach a gospel. We haven't done that yet. We've talked about portions of the gospels, but I have yet to teach through an entire gospel, which I'm excited to do because, like I said, this is my not only area of expertise, but area of interest. And so to begin talking about the Gospel of Mark, I want to ask this question: what is a gospel? In other words, when we think of a gospel, our minds go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? But imagine an audience in the first century. The Gospel of Mark was the first gospel written. And so they receive this gospel. In many ways, I think that what the gospel authors do is they kind of create a new genre of literature in a way, because what they do is kind of unique from other writings that we have from the Greco-Roman period of both Romans as well as Jews. But you can't create a new genre without building on top of another one. In other words, when you create a new genre of something, typically what you're doing is you're taking an old genre and you're changing something about it. And so when you think about the Gospels, they are primarily a genre that a first century audience would have been familiar with some slight changes that make them unique, that could lead someone, as some scholars do, to argue that the Gospels are a unique new genre, which I think there's a case to be made there, but it's being built on another type of genre. And I say that to say, so you think about, you're the first audience of the Gospel of Mark, you were the first people to receive this gospel and to hear it read. What kind of work, what kind of genre would you think that it is?
Good news.
And it's good news, because Mark in and of the Gospel of Mark begins with this phrase: the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. That's my translation, by the way. I don't think any English ones quite translate it that way, but that's my translation of the opening line of the Gospel of Mark. And to identify the genre of a work is vital to accurate interpretation. So when you read an advertisement, you read that differently than a legal document, which you read differently than a novel, right? You have different expectations of what you're reading. So you read an advertisement, you go into that expecting they're trying to trick me into buying this, maybe, right? That's what the point of an advertisement is, to get us to go out and purchase something. So maybe when you read an advertisement, you might ask questions like, well, what can this teach me about the product? But maybe you're also asking questions like, well, what are they not saying? How are they trying to sell me to buy whatever it is? So you're going to read that differently than if you were reading a contract, and you're reading a contract and you're very focused less on what they're trying to sell you and probably more on like the verbiage that's used in the contract. What is being restricted, what is being allowed, what can be done, what can't be done. You're going to read that a little differently. And both of those you're going to read very differently than if you go to Barnes & Noble and pick up the latest Stephen King novel. You're going to read that quite differently as well. You can also think about it, I think, in terms of like a movie. If you went to see a horror movie, you might expect the movie to scare you, and if it ended up just being a comedy, you might be a bit disappointed because that's not the genre of movie you came to see. Vice versa, if you went to see a nice family-friendly comedy and that was your expectation, and it was a blood-infested horror movie, you would also probably be disappointed, maybe even a little bit angry and upset, because that's not the genre of movie that you went to see, right? And so the genre of a work is important, because I mentioned this last week. The genre determines how an author writes and how a reader reads. It's an agreement between an author and an audience. So you think about the movie and this agreement. If I'm going to see a comedy movie, it's an agreement between me and the writer of the comedy that he's going to make something that I can show up to and is going to make me laugh. And when that doesn't happen, there's a problem, because we have this agreement by him stating that what he's writing is a comedy and me showing up to see a comedy. And so to identify the genre of the Gospels is, I think, crucial to understanding it. What kind of agreement is the author trying to make with us as the audience? What type of literature are they writing that's going to affect the way that we read it? Now, a lot of the times when we read the Gospels, we approach them as a biography of the life of Jesus. We read the Gospels a lot of the times very similar than, again, if you went to Barnes & Noble and you grabbed a biography or a history book of the life of Abraham Lincoln, and in order to learn about Lincoln, we read the Gospels typically in a very similar fashion as a biography of, I read this to learn about Jesus. Now, for us, there's more at stake than a biography of Abraham Lincoln, right? Because we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and we're reading it not just to learn about him, but by learning about Jesus, to learn something about ourselves and about our faith and the way we are to live. It's typically how we approach the Gospels. And I'll just come out and say that is a terrible way to read the Gospels, because first thing that I want to talk about this morning is that a Gospel is not a modern biography. Not is in all capitals. It is not a modern biography. And it's in red, so it is not a modern biography. Just in case you couldn't see it, it is not a modern biography. Here's a couple things to think about if you were to compare one of the Gospels to a modern biography. So if you did a side-by-side comparison of the Gospel of Mark and that biography of Abraham Lincoln that you pick up at Barnes & Noble, there's some major differences that you would quickly pick up on, I think. For example, modern biographies focus on an individual's entire life. We learn about, a lot of the times, about their parents, and then about when they were born, their childhood, their life and career, and then their death. One thing you may have noticed about the Gospels of Jesus is that we get nothing about Jesus' childhood. Only two of the Gospels talk about Jesus' birth. Matthew and Luke talk about Jesus' birth, and then we get the little temple scene, right, when he's about 12 years old. But then in essence, you jump from Jesus' birth to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The Gospel of Mark includes nothing before the ministry of Jesus. It opens with the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. It moves in to the prediction about the coming of John the Baptist, and then it says, John the Baptist began baptizing out in the wilderness, and then Jesus comes to him and is baptized, and then his ministry begins. You get 15 verses of introductory stuff, which is just John the Baptist baptized, Jesus was baptized, his ministry begins. So you get in Mark nothing before Jesus is 30 years old. It's pretty much the same in the Gospel of John. Now, John goes back to pre-existence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But when you move, then the Word became flesh, and then Jesus starts his ministry. So John skips from before time to when Jesus is 30 years old. So John has maybe an even bigger gap that he skips. And you don't get a birth narrative, you don't get any of that in Mark or John, which is very different than what we would expect from a modern biography. Modern biographies seek to be unbiased. They're not, but that's what a good biography seeks to do, to claim objectivity, to claim to tell the facts. No one can write unbiasedly, but I would argue a good modern biography or a good modern history book, the author tries to be as unbiased as they can. They try to be objective. They try just to present the facts of this person from history and let us make our own decisions about what we think of this person. There are bad biographies out there that are very, very heavily biased, and we generally consider them not very good biographies, but a good biography we generally think is something that tries to be unbiased. This is also not the Gospels. If you read through the Gospels, you will notice that the Gospels are very, 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 very biased. John's the only Gospel that tells us why he wrote the Gospel. In John 20 and verse 31, John says that he wrote the Gospel so that you may believe, or that you may continue believing. It can be translated either way. John just comes out and says, I'm not writing this unbiased. I'm not writing just to present you some facts about Jesus. I'm writing to convince you to believe in Jesus. In that way, it's closer to an advertisement than it is to a modern biography, because John tells us that he is biased in what he's writing. Modern biographies are chronological, generally. So you get that biography of Abraham Lincoln, you go from his birth to his childhood, to his early career, to his presidential campaign, to his time as president, to his death, and then maybe you get into some things that happen following his death, right? Everything goes in a chronological order. You can compare any two Gospels together and you will figure out that they are not chronological, because none of the Gospels tell the events in the exact same order. Now, there's a little bit exception to that we won't get into, that may be a little bit more in depth than we want to go into, but generally the Gospels aren't writing things in their historical, chronological order, which is why the events are in different orders in all four Gospels. Modern biographies normally try and understand the motivations and inner thoughts of the individual. So not every modern biography, but a lot of modern biographies want to dive into why someone does what they do. So why did Lincoln free the slaves? Why? What was his motivation? What in his career led him to that moment to make the decisions in the way that he does? Something that's very interesting about the Gospels is we get virtually, there's a few exceptions, but virtually no inner thoughts of Jesus. We get the inner thoughts of everybody else. So Jesus goes and does things, and we're like, well, this is what the Pharisees were thinking. This is what the disciples were thinking. This is what the crowds are thinking. But very rarely do we ever get what Jesus is thinking. Exceptions to that are, there's a story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus meets someone who is, I think they're lame, but he's grieved. And so we get a little bit of an insight of Jesus is grieved by this lame man that he comes across. The other example would be, we get a little bit of that in Jesus' prayer in the garden, right? He prays for the cup to pass from him. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning in the sermon. But we get a little insight into what Jesus is thinking. But other than those examples, we get very little to nothing of the motivations and inner thoughts of Jesus. And finally, modern biographies tend to care about the connection between events. How event A caused event B that caused event C. This might be easier to think of in a modern history book. So you read a history book of World War II, and it's going to be very concerned with the connection of events. How did this event lead to that event that led to this other event? What's the cause and effect that led to the war playing out in the way that it did? Also, the Gospels do not overtly connect events in this way, with the exception of the crucifixion. Crucifixion is the only event that the Gospels dig in a little bit to the cause, what led to Jesus being crucified. But other than that, they kind of leave out this connection to events. So the Gospels read very differently than a modern biography, which leads to the question of, well, then what is a gospel? What is the genre? What would an original recipient of a gospel think about the literature that they're reading? Well, the answer is the Gospels are ancient bios, which is the singular. Bio is the plural. That's a Greek word. the Greek word for life or living or something like that. And so they're also called ancient lives. And what that is in essence an ancient biography. That's where we get the word. We get biography from this Greek word bios or bios. You can pronounce it either way. An ancient biography functioned very, very differently than a modern biography. So that's why we make scholars will make the distinction. They will say a gospel is not a biography, it is a bios or bios. It's an ancient life of Jesus because it is functioning in the way that lives or biographies function in the Greco-Roman culture, which is very differently than the way that they would function today. Let me give you some examples. A lot of this I'm going to be reading straight from an introduction to the New Testament by the scholar David De Silva, who's done a lot of writing on the Gospels as ancient bios. This is what he says in describing these types of work. He says, many of these lives construct a basic chronological framework for the life of the subject of the narrative, but they set within that framework illuminating anecdotes and stories that show more of the character of the subject and often the philosophy of life or teaching of the subject without claims to strict chronological order, especially in the case of philosophers as opposed to figures in public life. Often a more topical arrangement characterizes the ordering material. Stories linked by a common setting or theme or narrated in a group, even if they were separated by years. The author often gives detailed attention to how the subject approached and faced death, since this was the ultimate proof of his or her character and way of life. In the ancient world, you had a lot of bios or lives that were written of people, particularly of philosophers. So you think of a great philosopher like Plato. Those who followed his philosophy after his death might write a life about him, a book about his life. But the way they're going to do it with the philosopher is it's going to have a rough chronological outline. So you're going to begin with his birth and end with his death. But everything in between is going to be organized less based upon the historical chronology and more along things like themes. So you would bring together Plato's teaching on A, and you would bring together Plato's teaching on B and C, which makes sense for the life of a philosopher, right? You want to know, well, what did Plato teach about life? What did Plato teach about death? And he taught things throughout his entire life about it. And you probably don't want a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there. You want them all brought together. Well, here's what he taught about life. Here's what he taught about death. You might bring together things on a particular setting. So you think, let's think in modern terms. Let's say you were writing an ancient life about someone who went and taught several classes at a university, but the classes that he taught were separated by years. You might bring all those together and place him in a classroom and said, this is what so-and-so taught at this university. You bring all their teachings together, though there are gaps of years in between each piece of thing that he taught. That was what was normal. And the reason was because you were ordering it in a way to try and convince your audience to believe and follow the philosophy of Plato. That's why you would write a life. You would want his teachings to carry on and spread to other people. And so how do you spread that? How do you convince people to follow Plato? Well, one of the best ways is to organize his teachings by theme and location, and then to focus on death. So for the ancient people, the way that you died demonstrated whether or not your way of life was good. So Plato presents a way of life. If he dies as a coward, then most ancient people would say, well, his way of life is not worth following. Look at how it ended up. He ended up being shamed publicly because he died as a coward. Take all that and apply it to the ministry of Jesus. The Gospels have a rough chronology. Jesus' birth, Jesus' ministry, Jesus' death. But within that, every author chooses to tell the stories in a different order. They're gathered together in a different way. Take something, for example, like the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. You can compare that to Luke has Jesus preaching a sermon on a plain. So you have two different locations. You have some of the same stories. So they both include Beatitudes, though they read a little bit differently. But Matthew's is much, much longer. It includes a lot of things that are not included in Luke's Gospel of Luke's Sermon on the Plain. So what's going on there between Matthew and Luke? Well, likely it's this idea. What Matthew is doing is he's bringing together similar teachings. So you have Jesus say, you've heard that it was said in the law that you shall not whatever. And then Jesus extends it, right? You shall not murder, I say to you, you shall not even become angry at your brother. You have heard that it was said in the law that you should not commit adultery. I say to you, you shall not lust. What's likely going on there is not necessarily that Jesus, in that chronological order, just said all these things. What's more likely is that Jesus, at different moments, in different contexts, said, you've heard that it was said, this, that, and the other thing. And Luke and Matthew, wanting to emphasize, how does Jesus talk about the law? That's kind of the question of that portion of the Sermon on the Mount. He brings all these together and says, well, Jesus said this, and then he said that, and then he said this other thing about the law. And now together you can see this is Jesus' approach to the law. He expands it. He says, not only do you not do these evil things in the law, but I'm heightening the requirement and saying you not only don't murder, you don't become angry. Not only do you not commit adultery, you do not lust. Then the Gospels spend the majority, if you do it by percentage-wise, the majority of every Gospel is spent on Jesus' passion, so his death. And in the ancient world, where a person's way of life was determined in part by the way that they died, that would also be something important for the Gospel writers to emphasize. Jesus' life is worth following because look at the way that he died. Jesus died not only for no reason, but he died heroically in the way that it is presented. But not just that, you get with the Gospels, you get the added piece of, well, he also raised. And so you can now, in the way that you could judge Plato's life by his death, you can judge Jesus' life by his death, which is the way that the Gospels are organized. A lot closer to the way that we know that lives or biographies were written in the ancient world. I say this to then say that this is why I'm very much opposed to harmonies of the Gospels. If you've ever read something where it brings the stories of the Gospels all together as if they're one, the problem with doing that is twofold. One, you have to make up a chronology because none of them are chronological, and so you have to kind of impose your own made-up chronology upon it, which is ultimately going to be flawed. But the other reason is you miss why the authors tell the stories in the places that they do. Why does Matthew bring together all these sayings of Jesus about the law? Well, you miss that if you harmonize it with Luke. And you don't get to ask, why does Luke tell the story in the place that he does? Have you ever wondered why Jesus preaches on a plain in Luke and on a mountain in Matthew? Well, because mountains are very important to Matthew. On top of a mountain is where God gave the law. Matthew is presenting Jesus as the new Moses, the new lawbringer. So it makes sense that Jesus would talk about the law on top of a mountain. It makes sense that Jesus would be transfigured on top of a mountain. It makes sense that Jesus would die on a mountain. That's all important to Matthew. And you miss that if you try to harmonize Matthew with Luke, because they're telling things not in chronological order to make a point, to, like John says, to get you to believe, to convince you to do something. Yes.
So Matthew was one of the disciples, so he was with Jesus when all those events were taking place, correct?
Possibly.
Um,
Possibly. Yeah.
He was it. I mean, he was like one of the core group. And I keep thinking that Luke was getting the information secondhand and gathering it together and writing it down, still inspired that he wasn't there at the minute it happened. I guess that's right.
Yeah. So
I guess the more detail from Matthew, I'm just seeing that, although it looks really detailed, but Matthew seems to have like some really accurate, I'm not that the other's not accurate, but like you say, when you're trying to harmonize them, they're different, and then their personalities are coming through, because Matthew is a tax collector and seems to be really smart.
Yeah.
And really-
So, something I'll say on that real quick that will be important, I think, for our study of Mark, because we're going to get into authorship and stuff like that. And the Gospels originally didn't circulate with names on them. So, Paul's letters to the Romans, I, Paul, to the church in Rome. So we know who's writing it and who he's writing to. The Gospel of Mark would have just begun in the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So we have to kind of try to read behind the text and figure out who might be writing this and who might they be writing it to. Church tradition eventually attributes authors to the Gospels, but it's very late. So the Gospel of Mark, the first person to say that Mark wrote it was Papias in the 2nd century, but the only way we know that is not because of Papias. We have nothing that still exists today that Papias wrote. It's Eusebius in the 4th century who quotes Papias, who said it was written by Mark. So think about this for a minute. Mark was written, let's say 68 AD. Papias in, let's say 120, says, oh, Mark wrote that some 60 years later. How Papias wasn't even born until about 20 years after Mark was already written. So it leaves you to wonder, is Papias accurate in saying that? But we don't even have Papias' words. We have Eusebius' words, who are 200 plus years removed, saying, well, Papias said that Mark wrote it. And that's true for all 4 Gospels, which leaves people wondering, well, did the people who wrote it actually write it? And at the end of the day, I don't think that matters. We'll talk about that more when we get to the authorship. But the interesting thing is, the best cases that you can make for traditional authorship are Mark and Luke, who were not eyewitnesses. And part of that is because you think about somebody like Luke, who was kind of an obscure character in the New Testament. If you were making up an author, you probably wouldn't choose him. You choose Peter, right? Peter was there for everything. You would choose someone like John, who was there for everything. You would choose someone like James, who was there for, you wouldn't, if you were making it up, you wouldn't pick Luke. And Luke tells us that he gathered information. So Luke's like a modern historian. Right? He's going around talking to people, gathering information, and seeks to put together, Luke says, an orderly account. Orderly doesn't mean chronological. Orderly means I sought to put this all together in a way that is easy for you to understand, so that you may believe and follow the way of Jesus, which is the whole point of not just the Gospels, but of any life that was written in the ancient world. They wanted you to follow the way of life of this person. And that's what the Gospel authors are trying to do. I say that to say the authorship that's most debated is actually the 2 that would have been actual eyewitnesses. So Matthew, let me back up. Mark was the first gospel that was written, about 68. Matthew was written probably about 10 years later or so, late 70s. Luke probably in the 80s. John likely in the 90s. The Gospel of Mark was used in the composition of Matthew and Luke. So when Luke talks about sources that he gathered together, the Gospel of Mark was one of them. And the way that we know that is because Luke copies Mark word for word. And so if you were a teacher and you looked at the two homework assignments that they turned in, you would know that they cheated off of each other. Luke cheated off of Mark, which makes sense because you think Luke is writing 20, 30 years later. Mark has circulated. Luke knows Mark. Why would he not, when he's gathering evidence, take this other gospel? And so Luke and Matthew kind of become an expansion of the Gospel of Mark. Something else that's interesting is where the chronology lines up between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is in the places that Matthew and Luke copy Mark. So Matthew and Luke don't change the order of the events of Mark very much. They add stories in there. And what's very interesting, maybe not to you, but it is to me, in the Gospel of Matthew, the places where Matthew has original material that is not found in Luke are in the teaching sections of Jesus. So one of the unique things about the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus has 5 teaching sections, 5 blocks of teaching, which mirror the 5 books of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, because Jesus is the new Moses. So Jesus' 5 teaching sections reflect the 5 books of Moses. So, in other words, Matthew takes Mark, and he wants to add to Mark, and Matthew's sitting there at his writing desk and asking, how do I want to do this? Well, what he does is he takes the order of Mark, and he adds, in essence, 5 teaching sections. And so where you get the unique things to Matthew are in these 5 teaching sections that he adds in there to present Jesus as the new Moses. There's also some evidence that John used the Gospel of Mark as well. So they all used Mark. They all copied off of Mark. Now, here's the one interesting thing, and I guess I'll leave this to you to go and contemplate for the next week. But Matthew tells the story of the conversion of Matthew, right? When Jesus comes and calls Matthew to be a disciple. And when he tells that story, he copies it verbatim from the Gospel of Mark, which is a very strange thing to do if it's your own conversion story, which sheds some doubt on whether or not Matthew actually wrote Matthew. With all that being said, when we study the Gospels, whether it be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's why, for me, I tend to approach them by not trying to think too much about the author. So, for example, Luke is well educated. And you can tell that he has the best Greek of any of the Gospels. We normally say, well, that's because Luke was a physician, which is possible, but physicians would not have been the only people who knew how to write very well in the ancient world. And so, for example, when I think about Luke, I don't want to place too much weight on, well, Luke said this because he was a physician. Well, maybe, but there's other just as logical explanations for why Luke was saying that. It's also assuming that Luke the physician was the only Luke in the ancient world. And Luke was a very, very common name, as was Matthew, as was Mark, as was John. So just because Mark wrote it, or Luke wrote it, or Matthew wrote it, or John wrote it, does not help us figure out which Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote it, because there was a lot of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Johns in the early church. And we talked about that, if you remember, with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So 2nd John is written by John the Elder. And church tradition says in the 1st century church, there was John the Apostle and John the Elder, who were both leaders. Which leaves us wondering, well, which John wrote this? Was it John the Apostle, or was it John the Elder? And at the end of the day, we don't know, which brings me to my point of not placing too much weight in our interpretation on, well, it means this because so-and-so wrote it, is probably going to be a little bit of a faulty argument, because you would then have to argue why so-and-so wrote it, and there's very, very little evidence of who wrote it other than, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to what we're going to talk about next week. What sets the Gospels apart, right? So we can do all of this comparison with Gospels and other ancient writings. We can talk about who wrote them, who might have wrote them, who didn't write them. We can do all of that. And at the end of the day, what sets the Gospels apart from other ancient pieces of literature is the work of the Holy Spirit. And so at the end of the day, That's why I can say I love talking about who might have written these and who they might have written them to. But at the end of the day, the reason I don't think that matters a whole lot is because I believe the ultimate author is God. And while human author and audience might help interpret some of the more difficult passages in the Gospels, because God's the ultimate author, I can still read the Gospels, I can still learn about Jesus, I can still model my life after him, regardless of who I think the Gospels were written by, or who they were written to, or when they were written. And so, a lot of this historical stuff that we're going to talk about at the beginning, I think is helpful for us interpreting some of the finer details of the Gospel, but at the end of the day aren't all that important.